Now, the Murdoch scum is called scum because it is a platform for scum and lies and liars. It's celebrating on page 2 Trump's being cured. It says Donald Trump claimed to be cured of COVID-19 yesterday and boasted that he had a protective glow. The US President, 74, said he was immune from the virus a week after being released from hospital. He is to fly to Florida today, that is Monday, the 12th of October 2020. Then Pennsylvania and Iowa this week for more election rallies, despite declining to reveal his test results. Mr. Trump also defended his decision to speak without a mask to fans at the White House on Saturday, adding, "I was on a balcony." And above that, on page 2, is a very sick-making, deadly PR for Ian Dracula Duncan Smith. Now, Dracula Duncan Smith is the person who kind of aggravated the criminal nature of the denial, deprivation, want, and poverty creation, in other words, DWP, which was renamed by Tony Blair. And Dracula Duncan Smith, who broadly represents the same constituency as had been occupied by Norman Tebbit. Now, Dracula Duncan Smith has been allowed exemption and immunity from any analysis and any examination of his record by the Guardian, by the Labour Party, by everyone, despite the fact that I filmed Jeremy Corbyn in March 2016, referring to the severe hardship and poverty that Dracula Duncan Smith had caused the people to suffer in this country. But Corbyn was not opposing the political agenda that Dracula Duncan Smith was aggravating and foisting, or had foisted and aggravated. The two kind of noted occasions when the Public Accounts Committee, which was chaired at both times by Margaret Hodge, when Margaret Hodge kind of appeared to be critical of the permanent secretary at the Department for Deaths and Wants and Poverty Creation. Robert Debarrow. Now, Debarrow was the longest serving, or one of the longest serving permanent secretaries in any of the UK central government department. And Debarrow was a poisonous, shameless liar. And he was caught lying in the parliamentary kind of conventional way by Margaret Hodge's committee. But despite that fact, neither Hodge in her report nor any members of this then DWP Select Committee of MPs, chaired by Anne Bagg, a Scottish Labour MP at the time, made any significant comment about the deadly role that the DWP was playing in brazenly breaking the legal obligations to safeguard people and save people from harm and detriment. And it was Robert Devereux, working with Dracula Duncan Smith, who pushed any number of people, because the number is not the final number, the actual number is not known. Not even the National Audit Office has got any clue as to the actual number of people who were forced to commit suicide, forced by their benefits claims being rejected. Now, the Labour Party knew that was happening, yet there is no record of the Labour Party or any Labour MPs, including Diane Abbott and her former boyfriend, Jeremy Corbyn, making any significant or any noise in Parliament about that, let alone any movement among the MPs to stop that massacre. So this point I make because earlier in the first edition, we talked about Corbyn being demonized by Fleet Street. But this is the other side of the factual, evidence-based reference to Corbyn and his role. And as I've said many times, Corbyn is overstated as a leader in terms of his so-called left-wing kind of leanings. My finding, my thesis is that Corbyn is empty of substance. It doesn't matter whether his substance is left, right, or center. And I have explained many times that Corbyn exhibited his lack of substance, objectively defined, by running away, literally running away from collected, mainly broadcast media crews gathered outside his home in Islington, London, whenever he came out of his house to go somewhere. And that stint as leader and his role as a runner away from the assembled media, right-wing media, without any doubt, predominantly right-wing in any case, summed up Jeremy Corbyn's unfitness. He didn't even understand the engagement, the rules of engagement, quite apart from the contents of what he would say or could say. The fact that he ran away and he sprinted away from the crew embodied a running, an empty, an unfit leader. Now, if any diligent person, researcher, observer, student collects together all the bad things that the Conservatives have been doing to the, quote, many in the last 10 years, it would appear that every day of the week, every hour of the day carries hundreds of examples across the country of the Tories being genuinely being found guilty and found engaged in criminality and violations. Yet Corbyn never made a list, nor did any of his so-called shadow cabinet. And Corbyn has been like this. Corbyn has been like this the whole number of years he has been a member of parliament. As I said earlier and many times in the last kind of years, the barometer kind of testing clue as to what line or the agenda or the kind of movement a particular member of parliament is following not necessarily carrying out, but following the line and the agenda, is given in a little referred to routine called early day motion or EDMs. Early day motion is a kind of formal tabling of emotion, just literally emotion, a kind of resolution for adoption by the House of Commons. Most of the EDMs are never debated, let alone supported. But the list of the EDMs tabled by members of parliament gives a clue as to what a particular MP is doing. Because as is known in the unwritten constitution, in the undemocratic British democracy, members of parliament are not legally obliged to answer questions put to them by their electors. This is something that my campaign has recently established from the House of Commons in information people. So therefore, you look at the newspapers, you look at the Guardian, you look at the Mirror, you look at the media for some kind of indication as to what an MP is doing or what MPs are doing. And you don't find anything. As I have said, the Guardian is not a left-wing liberal paper. The Guardian is a right-wing paper posing to be in connection or in touch with the left, so-called. And there's a business pretension. It's not a ethical commitment to upholding the rights. So the Guardian, which is praised in the USA and in Australia and other kind of British colonial kind of regions, cultural colonial regions, the Guardian is not any different in terms of the substance, in terms of the agenda that it follows in comparison with the right-wing mainstream brazen practitioners of imperialism, racism, xenophobia, and all the other things. So where do the people go? Where do people seeking the truth go? Where do they look for the truth? It's not available from the behavior of the MPs, from the speeches of the MPs, and it's not available from the liberal dressed part of Fleet Street. And it most certainly is not available from the broadcasting outlets, either BBC or ITV or Channel 4 or Sky News. So where do the people who need to know, who must know what is going on in parliament, in politics, in the law, where do they go for the information? They go for information to search in the media, either in the current context, online search engines, which are being completely squeezed by the day because less information is available online than used to be even 3 years ago. So where do people look for the information and where do they find them? There is no place where the information is found. There is no certain place where the information is found. And the media and Fleet Street is most certainly not where the information is. Because, for example, as I said, they are presenting Ian Dracula Duncan Smith as the revolutionary. Can you believe that? He is the reactionary personified. So he is the one who starved people, and he is the one that is one of the Brexiteers. He is one of the people who supported the narrative and still support the narrative that underlies the conditions which caused the massacres of the Grenfell Tower people, for example. Because as I said, architecturally and environmentally and in terms of kind of aerial access, the Grenfell Tower was very isolated, very clean. It's all the surroundings, all the sides, absolutely empty space. So any aircraft or any military helicopter or a dozen helicopters could access the building with emergency supply of water, which they refused to carry out. They refused to take that option. And my observation is that that is the definitive proof of massacre, because they had enough time, because the building was on fire for hours. And we could see it online. It was being beamed, it was broadcast live. So we saw that for hours. The Grenfell Tower was on fire for hours, and there was no water being poured from all sides, which were all clear. There were no buildings anywhere nearby, so there was no block. There was no blocking of any access by any aircraft, miniature, smaller aircraft. So that is the one definitive proof of the massacre that they wanted to happen. This is something that is coming to you from this Kudilar campaign, exclusive diagnosis of the media. And the media, whenever it comes to the Sun and the other tabloid, written for the gullibles, that is to say, their preferred kind of people lacking cognitive powers and abilities, as the Spectator has been saying the majority of the northern people are. They draw detailed, elaborate, graphic kind of images showing various war zones and entry points and various points of conflagration. I mean, they can do that with completely no real relevance to the people reading the papers. Because these are like, for example, the maps that they carry about Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan. These are interesting as illustrations because of the stories, but they're not interesting as directly impacting the communities in this country as the Grenfell Tower fire and its treatment does affect and did affect people. And yet, the newspapers have not done anything remotely comparable about the Grenfell Tower and the fact that I've been talking about in the gap, the huge space that exists even now between the building and the rest of the neighborhood and the estates and the area. It's all empty space, and it could be reached, the building could be reached, accessed by military helicopters and other emergency aircraft carrying water. And they could have saved most of the people. They could have completely kind of sunk the building underwater, if you like. But they didn't do that. And it was the fire that killed the people. Fire and of course, the lack of air and the lack of kind of exit. But the fire was the single most important killer. So if the newspapers are interested in telling the truth, then they would be listing the numbers of people that died as a result of the DWP sanctioning and refusing money to the poorest and the most vulnerable and the sickest people that genuinely needed money and were denied the money, and they were left with no option but to commit suicide according to their kind of situation. There was no help. And the Labour Party, including the Labour Party MPs like Corbyn, because Corbyn has been there for decades as an MP, so they didn't create an early demotion or a more substantive way to debate this and to hold the government to account and to deliver accountability for the victims and justice for them, or a kind of semblance of justice for the people and anyone who survived by any relation, because many of the people were probably single persons and many of them were probably in positions where they didn't have any blood relations or family relations. So including all of those people, the Labour Party has not done anything, even when people are being killed long before this pandemic hit this country. And the so-called conference that Starmer fronted last month, or recently, let's say, last month, the remote conference was a complete, absolute disgrace. It was not political, it was not democratic, and it was not an alternative to the conservatives, and it was not what the society, the people in this country need. It was a completely, typically empty, insubstantial, if you like, substance-free in that way, not substance in the sense of the drug, but substance in the sense of kind of merit, unmeritorious Labour Party. And as I have been saying, every time Starmer stands in the charade called PMQs, Starmer comes off completely empty, or emptier than he had done before. This is not a positive comment for Johnson. This is a standalone, if you like, commentary on Starmer performance. And there is no reflection, there is no reporting of his emptiness in the papers. And as I say, this guy, John Crace, who is the current kind of parliamentary so-called sketch writer at The Guardian, is the only one that comes anywhere near, within miles, of course. I mean, he doesn't get there, but he approaches in the correct kind of direction when he aims to have a look at the facts and the evidence. But obviously the editor, Catherine Viner, or Vanity, must be holding him back as well. And The Guardian, the rest of The Guardian, the politics so-called, is no different from Murdoch's papers or the Daily Mail's kind of line, or the Boris Kraft's line. So once again, the question is, where do the people in Britain go to for information, for the evidence, for the facts? Because it's not available in the behavior, in the speeches, in the activities of the members of parliament, even of the Labour Party and the SNP, and it's not available in the media. So where do they go to? They can't go anywhere because it's a kind of cul-de-sac. It's a kind of blockage. It's a blocked route. You can't go anywhere. It's a kind of no turning point, no going there, nowhere. It's a nowhere place. So this kind of thing, painting Ian Dracula Duncan Smith as the revolutionary, when in fact he should be tried for murder, systematic murder, because the suicides of those people were forced on them. And everyone knows that. So, is there in the judiciary an independent mechanism? It's a trigger. Do the judges act on the impulse of conscience? Is there such a thing? There should be, in a thing that is called justice, Ministry of Justice, and Royal Courts of Justice, and the courts of justice in this country. So therefore, where is the justice? Is there a trigger in the British judicial bureaucracy that comes into action when justice is denied, justice is threatened? No, there isn't. And the word justice is a complete misnomer. It's an insult to the injury. The judges and the judiciary, the judicial bureaucracy, they only operate as based on the two things. One is the money that a party can bring into the action, and the other is the very restricted access to even the bureaucracy. The restricted access meaning that those who, quote, appear in an action must be licensed law traders. And they and the benches, the people, the so-called judges, most of them belong to the licensed law trade. And there is no option for the victims of injustice, victims of robbery of rights, and survivors or bereaved people whose dear loved ones have been murdered by this DWP, which is one of the known agencies of the state that commits murders like that. So this country at the present time is not only far, far away from the ideals of the founding aims of the United Nations 75 years ago, let's say that is what they're saying. It is in a place that is in a worse situation than Western Europe was in the decades before the 39-45 Nazi kind of conflagration. And going by the proliferation, the preponderance, the dominant kind of propaganda for the image of Jeremy Corbyn, that his bots and other assorted morons paint of him as a savior, you would imagine, or logically it would be expected to be found in their contents. These references that I have just made, summarized, I have simplified and abbreviated and given a summary of. But there isn't. The so-called Corbynistas don't understand the United Nations. They don't care. So they are the left side of the racist coin, the imperialist coin. They don't recognize the United Nations. They don't recognize the international order. They don't recognize the ideals underlying the United Nations even now. So this is a country now in darkness. Some people are saying that it's going into darkness. It's not. It has been in darkness for the increasing number of years, and the darkness has been enveloping this country with increasing kind of spread and lack of resistance from the time that Tony Blair got the so-called overstated landslide and the two other kind of wins in 2001 and 2005. All of those were confected by lying and presenting the Labour Party as the right wing, as the Conservatives. That is how they got the election. And the warmongers, when Blair got the election 2001, it was entirely based on his complicity already underway with George W. Bush and the military-industrial complex and the big conglomerates the oil and other conglomerates that were bent on looting the supplies from Saudi Arabia and Iraq and other places where the natural resources were in plenty. So, where is the way forward? These people who took part in the kind of so-called resistance, this thing about the London Renters Union claiming to be resisting the eviction regime returning. They are completely now so soon that within 1 year they have become just like any other kind of pliant charity kind of campaigning name campaigners, but in action they're compliant with the status quo. They've dropped the demands and they've completely detached themselves away from any claim to hold the local councils accountable, any claim to hold the court system accountable. These people are worse than pathetic politically because they are now saying that the targets are the big landlords. Big landlords are only one part of the problem. Big landlord or small landlord. Landlords are only one part of the problem. The other two parts are the local court system that actually rubber stamps the application for eviction, and the councils which are colluding in creating the absolute nightmare in every aspect about housing, because the local councils are the local deliverers of this housing relief or whatever, and they're not doing their job. And the London Renters Union and the Acorn, which is the one that is wider than London or based outside of London, they are following the same kind of tactics and the same narrative, which is similar to the narrative followed for decades by the Fabian organization and the Shelter, Child Poverty Action Group, and the Citizens Advice Bureau, and the RSPCA, and the NSPCA. These are compulsory, if you like, extensions of the vested interests, which is the councils, which is the central government departments, which is the parliament, which is each and every member of parliament. So you go to the ombudsman. Remember, we talked about the ombudsman, and we have to keep talking about the ombudsman because ombudsman is supposed to be, the idea of ombudsman is supposed to be the port of last resort when everything else fails, apparently. But the ombudsman and these so-called quangos, quasi non-governmental organizations that used to be called quangos, now they are called something else, but they are actually mainly describable as ombudsmen. They are again another facet of the obstruction to rights. So everywhere the citizen, say let's one citizen who has tried everything to get their rights as are kind of enshrined in the declarations of the United Nations, in the charters, in the agreements, in the conventions, in the spelled out aims and objects, and without derogation, recognized reluctantly, of course, in some of the reluctantly passed UK domestic legislation based on those declarations, or some of them. When all of these so-called enshrined rights and entitlements and essentially facts of the needs of the emergency, needs of the hours, when all of them are obstructed and denied and the very existence of the person is threatened, where do the individuals turn to? So the port of last recall or resort is, of course, the collection of these ombudsmen. So for the councils, there is the thing called local ombudsman. And for complaints about MPs, you can't go anywhere because you could be spending the rest of your physical life pursuing any complaint against an MP because that's that evasive. And Corbyn made no reference to this nightmare situation, just as Corbyn didn't make any reference to the nightmare created against the individual and against the families by the local councils. So Corbyn is not only not kind of with the community or the individuals under attacks by the rights being denied by the local council, he is also actually complicit with the agenda of the councils. So if you go to the local ombudsman, you could spend any number of years pursuing the complaint against the council. Now, is that practical? Is that real? Because your need is for the hour immediately. You need immediate action by the council to save you literally from being kind of frozen to death on the street if you are homeless. Where do you go? If you are in that situation, how can you even pursue a single complaint letter, let alone hundreds of letters that the local ombudsman demands of you? The same thing happens with the so-called legal ombudsman, the legal law traders, licensed law traders. If you are theoretically betrayed, let down, and ill-served, misrepresented, and your rights violated by a so-called solicitor, where do you go? You don't go to the court where it happened, because the court would not entertain a complaint like that. And you will be wasting your time, and you cannot have that time to waste. And if you go to the legal ombudsman or to the issuers or the origin of the license, that is the Inns of Court for barristers and the solicitors, regulation authority for solicitors, you could be looking at having to spend the entirety of your life pursuing this, and you will not get anywhere. And this nightmare goes on, which is why the many that Corbyn got right, the number he got right, the many are in the perennial position of being denied, deprived. And there is no evidence in Fleet Street or in the local papers of any of that. These are the headlines that are diversions. These are intended for football fans, brainless, thoughtless gullibles. These are nothing to do with the lack of accountability, lack of answerability, and lack of reliability in the promise of the institutions and the councils and the MPs or the councillors or the health facilities or care homes to give you the support that on the face of it they exist to provide. There is a thing in this country, in Britain, that I have noticed and observed, that in the online and billboard advertisements by these big corporations and banks, the images are mainly or almost mostly of African people as the bank's kind of staff or the NHS's faces. And even the police. In London, for example, the Metropolitan Police doesn't send police staff in mixed race kind of groups. It has got segregated police crews sent on missions most of the times. But the advertisements, the billboards, show black faces, African faces mainly. What is going on there? This is completely unrepresentative of what is actually going on in the inside those organizations and in their agendas. And so the Sun is talking about bed, the sleeping thing. I mean, the Sun is talking about people sleeping arrangements, not anything else really. And the Star is talking about the cloud, because the Star has been, as we have pointed out, talking about the virus crisis and the government's kind of response to it as the behavior of clowns and jokers. Now, it can be funny in a kind of setting of a pub where you have gossip, lame gossip and lazy gossip. But it really doesn't. It really doesn't take account of the lack of accountability and the absence of evidence and the facts. From A to Z, as I have been saying, where does the contact with the virus start and where does it end? And what happens in between? There is no reporting on the facts of the process. And they're talking about actually the surface, and they're not talking about the substance. And they're doing this one about Boris Johnson's two-tier. That is the same word, the same term used in the Times. The two tiers, meaning the two types of lockdown and measures. One for the north and one for the south. Now this is an aggregated kind of image which is not representative of the truth on the ground. Because although areas like Tower Hamlets or Newham or other parts of London or other boroughs, Islington, Hackney, maybe in the south, but there is severe denial of rights to the people by the councils and through the councils. And so that is not taken account of in the so-called kind of coverage about the two tiers. And this goes on everything. They're not talking about the facts, they're not talking about the evidence, and they're not, most certainly, not talking about the absence of any recourse, the complete dysfunctionality and the complete obstruction, the obstructive role being played by the ombudsman. Obstructive against the people seeking and needing remedies and redress. So if somebody's family member or relation is violated and denied rights, whatever, by the council, where do they go? If the same thing happens with the hospital, where do they go? They have to go to some other kind of party or agency or platform seeking remedies. But as I've been saying, that kind of remedy seeking will take the rest of your life. So you might as well not bother, which is what happens most of the times. So there is a darkness already covering most of the many who are denied any remedies. Most of the many that Corbyn boastfully referred to or used in his internally partisan kind of propaganda. And there is absolutely dozens and dozens and dozens of little items saying the same thing, like this one. UK is at tipping point, says government expert. Now this is repeated all over the place with permutations, different permutations, and different kind of names, different kind of description. But essentially, the line is that UK is in crisis. Of course it is in crisis, but there are hundreds of items in Fleet Street paper saying the same thing. but they're not saying A to Z. How the A to Z of the problem can be identified and reversed. They're not saying it. And so it applies to not only the virus, but to other illnesses and other diseases and other needs in terms of health and other needs in terms of social kind of accommodation, housing, and safety in housing and human rights. So the United Nations, as part of the 75th anniversary, is also observing various days like Mental Health Day, Girls Education Day, and anything that they can confect, they are doing it. But they are not relating it to the actual evidence of countries, country by country, which country is doing how much to uphold what kind of rights that the United Nations charters, the aims and conventions declare to be provided. And for example, the various details that have come out this week of Priti Patel, the UK Interior Minister in Boris Johnson-fronted cabinet of right-wingers and Brexiteers, that she is going to she's going to target the small number of migrants and put them at sea and do other things like kind of capture them, like snare them, like catch them by nets, lethal nets. Shows that she's treating these migrants and asylum seekers almost as if they're not human, as if they're not even alive, as if they're dead already, so that she can do anything with them. And there is absolutely nothing coming from the so-called left or the opposition on any of this. So here is a piece about the 12 billion. It says that the NHS test and trace system has already cost 12 billion. And they're saying that the councils to get more control of contract tracing following failures. But that says that the councils are not failures, that they won't fail. This is passing, it's a kind of, in terms of the narrative, they're passing the headline from being applied to the government, central government, to the local council, and the local council is being paraded as the solution to the failed central government. But the evidence is that the local councils are as bad, as dishonest, as dysfunctional as the central government, because there is no accountability for their failures, their corruption, their criminality. And there is a piece that is running in every kind of paper in Fleet Street about Sturgeon and Alex Salmond in bitter row over misconduct claims cover-up. That is about the sexual abuse and attempted rape allegations that Alex Salmond faced and has been cleared of. This row is about whether Nicola Sturgeon, who succeeded Salmond as leader of the SNP, tried to cover up. And she went on television yesterday, Sunday, to read some of the communications she sent to him, suggesting that she was not only not covering up, but she was telling him that she was not going to cover up for him. And there is plethora of conflicting news about the social distancing, about the lockdown and the next step. So there is a rare piece here on page 8 of the I newspaper, where the Green Party MP, Caroline Lucas, is saying for transparency of our £3 billion government contracts for PPE, which is the personal protective equipment. Green MP Caroline Lucas and Labour's Debbie Abrams and Liberal Democrat MP Laila Moran are seeking a judicial review of the government's actions, arguing there are mounting concerns over the coronavirus procurement process. And they're saying that the government is deliberately keeping the public in the dark. Now, judicial review will take hundreds of years, and it won't necessarily find the government guilty. That is the truth. And there is a piece on the 2-page spread on the Daily Mail, which is saying, this is killing us, Boris. Now they are talking about this lockdown thing and the queues. And every newspaper has got apparently unique kind of angle to it. But essentially, they are not original. They are completely artificial and false and fake. And it says on the pages 12 and 13 that Boris Johnson is refusing to deny MPs any say on protecting British farming standards, which is the standards being lowered in order to do the Brexiteering deal with the USA. So that's the level of kind of corruption and criminality, openly forcing deadly killer food on the UK population. That's what is happening. So it's darker than the darkest. But still, the Daily Mail is not calling Boris Johnson or his cabal enemies of the people. That's the thing that they called the judges in the Supreme Court enemies of the people. When the Supreme Court was hearing or preparing to hear the first application brought by Gina Miller against the Brexiteers. And those Brexiteers were fronted by Theresa May, trying to undermine Parliament. All of this shows that the fact that Gina Miller, who was not a member of the Labour Party, was the one that actually took the case. Whoever supported her, doesn't matter. Shows the emptiness and irrelevance of the Labour Party in Parliament and in politics. So therefore, there is no justification whatsoever for claiming that Boris Johnson is doing it alone by himself and that the Labour Party is not helping him. The Labour Party is very much helping him by being politically kind of completely dead. And it doesn't matter whether it's the leader is called Corbyn or Starmer. Substantially, there is no difference between the left and the right in the Labour Party. That's the finding on the evidence. And YouTube is claiming that they offer more to users than the BBC. And there is absolutely no shortage of various items that show the contradiction between the evidence and the claims. And the Boris graph is not telling the truth despite the appearance. And there is a piece on the business Boris graph that Facebook took money from 200 dubious and illegal and criminal, hateful sources of advertisements. And they're running a piece about the anti-racist movement against various statues of colonialists and racists. That Boris Johnson is set to give ministers a say to stop removal of statues of racists. Now, Libby Parvert is the one that had published a comment piece in the Times when Paul Decker was editing the Times in the early 1990s, and she had condemned a person who cared for the safety of a cat. Now, Libby Parvert is this is now 30 years she has been a columnist on the Times. There is no kind of response to her. A pervert and a criminal and a supporter and advocate of the cruelty to animals is given platform in the Times for 30 years. There is no sign that this status quo will change. And there is a piece by this guy, which is a rare piece in the Times or in any paper. This character is called a Regus professor of moral and pastoral theology at the University of Oxford. His name is Nigel Biggar. Now, Biggar is spelled with the Biggar. Now, he's saying that human rights is wrong. That's what he's saying. And his book is peddled here as What's Wrong with Rights? Now, obviously, everything he says is based on a denial of universal rights. That's what he's doing. But there is no kind of equal, let alone sufficient space given by the Times to expose his lying and his corruption. And there is a piece by Max Hastings. Now, why is this 32-year-old being made a High Court judge? Let's see what. So this 32-year-old person, a solicitor in the city of London called Jason Rayburn, whose father was an engineer from Grenada and his mother is from Ireland, is being peddled here as the youngest ever High Court judge. And although the official swearing in has not taken place, and this is being done to follow the report of the Judicial Appointments Committee that diversity is very rare and not many black people, meaning African Asian, are appointed judges. Well, this is a complicated kind of way of presenting a complete rubbish, because the judiciary is not wrong only because it hasn't got black members on the benches. But the judiciary in England is wrong because it is criminally unaccountable and irresponsible and inaccessible to those who currently deserve fair hearing. That is the thing that they should address, but they don't address that. As I said earlier, big corporations peddle images on the billboards and advertising kind of literature of black people, suggesting that they are diversity sensitive and they are carrying out diversity. Whereas inside each of the organization, there is complete racism, rampant racism and increasing racism and lack of diversity. So that is what is happening with the judiciary. And here is a piece that is reluctantly accepting the criticism of vaccine as the cure for the virus. And there is an the North kind of cartoon on the Times showing the 3 tiers: medium risk, high risk, or grim up north. Now, grim up north is an anti-northern kind of phrase. So that's what Boris Johnson is asking Matt Hancock, the so-called health secretary. But essentially, the point is completely prejudiced and biased and nothing to do with the facts or the evidence. And the whole of the papers, the press clears to today, is doing the same thing. And the only interested piece about the United Nations in the Times is when the United Nations is the subject of what they say is a effort by the Chinese to remake the United Nations. And the Times is saying hostile makeover. China's efforts to remake the United Nations must be met with resistance. Now that is stupid, because the United Nations, essentially, all the aims and objects and conventions and founding declarations are being violated by the UK and the West. And there is no editorial about those. So while it is acceptable that they should have an opinion about China trying to distort the United Nations, they have as much duty to point out the defiance of United Nations aims and objects by the Western countries, members of the Security Council, which they are not doing. And this is the same thing every day. As we said earlier, the Daily Express by Beaver Brooks kind of agenda carriers is lying. because millions face drastic new shutdown to save the NHS is a lie on every level. First of all, the government is not bothered about saving the NHS. In fact, it wants to shut down the NHS. It's not the shutdown just under COVID-19, but also the shutdown of the whole of the NHS and the idea of the NHS. And secondly, the Daily Express doesn't support the NHS. And thirdly, whatever the shutdown is kind of being propelled by or being presented as being caused by is not the truth. They're not telling the truth. They're not saying A to Z what are the stages that the virus travels or is traveling, and what are the evidence from the various clinical and empirical centers and sources of information, and what are the findings of any objective, independent, unbiased parties or observers. And there is this line by the Daily Express, which doesn't need being spelled out, but it is being spelled out brazenly, that Keir Starmer should form a coalition, COVID coalition with Boris Johnson. But Starmer is already behaving as a coalition with Boris Johnson. It doesn't need Hattie Harman's propagandist and racist liar Leo McKinstry to call for it, but that is what he is calling for. And Starmer is already in coalition with Boris Johnson, who is being given impunity from accountability. Now, this item by the Financial Times, the main item, Brussels draws up digital hit list to curb market power of big tech. This is a semi kind of complete picture, but it is a picture that is long overdue, that should be fully exposed to the public as to what the big techs are up to and why they should be held to account. They are currently on endless impunity from accountability for everything they do. And there is a plug for Indian market in the digital era, Indian economy, and the piece by the Financial Times, given a byline given to an African woman saying that aspirational families go the extra mile in order to get the best school for their children. Well, that again is an incomplete picture and misleading one, because that doesn't actually explain why that should be the case. Why the best school or the best schooling should not be available and is not available to all the children from all the backgrounds. And so, therefore, this edition we are concluding with a kind of summary of the papers being contradictory, fact-less, defiant of the facts, and faking it, and not holding the Boris Johnson fronted cabal to account. And the Labour Party is in worse state of incompetence than it had been before. And there is no recourse for the victims of injustice, victims of bad service or poor service or no service, because the so-called ombudsmen are nightmare experiences and they cannot be trusted even for a fraction of the justice that the victims deserve. They are aggravators of the denials and deprivations and injustices. And we shall be continuing the themes in the next edition.